The purpose of this session this evening is to provide you with information on the city's approach to implementing the mandatory provincial housing changes. This session will focus on provincial legislation related to transit-oriented areas and small-scale multi-unit housing. We will also provide you with information on the shoulder and corridor land use study areas, which we are reviewing as part of the transit-oriented areas update. So first, a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with gratitude and respect that the name Coquitlam was derived from the Hunkaminam word Coquitlam, meaning redfish up the river. The city is honored to be located on the Coquitlam traditional and ancestral lands, including those parts that were historically shared with the Katzie and other Coast Salish peoples. So we'll begin with some introductions. My name is Natasha Locke. I'm with the Community Planning Division. We also have Renee de Saint Croix, the Director of Community Planning.
Hello, everyone.
We've also got Chris Macbeth with Community Planning.
Hi, everyone.
James Taylor with Community Planning.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Tara Slater with Community Planning.
Hi, everyone.
Ryan Klemensic with Community Planning.
Good evening, everyone.
Tyler Cooney with Transportation.
Hello.
And Stephanie Holland with Parks and Facility Planning.
Hi, thanks. Good to be here.
And then we also have Sarah Rossi, who's with our communications, corporate communications and engagement.
Hello, everyone.
All right, so we're gonna kick things off with a presentation, which James Taylor will run through, after which we will open it up for question and answers or a Q&A. And we have a great turnout tonight. We've got approximately 380 people registered. So given the number of people to facilitate the Q&A, all questions are to be submitted through the Q&A function in your Zoom window. And I'll go over how the Q&A will work after the presentation. So over to James.
Thank you, Natasha. To begin, I'd like to first highlight the city's position with respect to the provincial housing legislation. So the Coquitlam is committed to addressing housing affordability and supply challenges within the framework of provincial legislation. The city is actively implementing the changes imposed by the provincial government, including enabling small-scale multi-unit housing, increasing density in transit-oriented areas, and updating our official community plan. These steps build on Coquitlam's strong housing record, with more than 5,100 homes created since 2021, including non-market and below-market units. These Coquitlam's award-winning housing affordability strategy remains a key driver in delivering diverse and inclusive housing options. While these efforts align with provincial objectives, we emphasize the importance of local expertise in community planning and continue to advocate for approaches that respect the city's unique neighborhoods. So as Natasha had indicated, this presentation focuses mainly on the city's approach to transit-oriented areas and small-scale multi-unit housing to a lesser extent. The information is generally the same as was shared in the October in-person public information sessions. However, I will be providing clarification on a number of elements relating to the legislation and the city's approach. The provincial housing legislation adopted in 2023 introduced two new planning frameworks intended to increase housing supply across the province. These are known as transit-oriented areas and small-scale multi-unit housing. The legislation imposes certain limitations on the city's normal authority to regulate development. And also imposes requirements on the city to implement certain planning and zoning changes. Importantly, a portion of the city's transit-oriented areas update project, which is our implementation project, is not required by the province. These are called shoulders and corridors. I will describe them in greater detail later in the presentation. For now, I would just like to highlight that completion of the shoulders and corridors requires community input and is subject to council feedback and approval. At the same time, the city has initiated a number of other projects which also relate to the provincial housing legislation. Many of these concern the mechanisms to fund the growth supporting infrastructure and amenities that we need to support this growth and to provide rental and affordable housing. Coquitlam's current system relies heavily on a density bonus program to fund these amenities and to incentivize rental. And the new legislation imposes rules that restrict this use. However, it also provides some new tools, such as the amenity cost charge program, rental tenure zoning, and inclusionary zoning. The city's objective in implementing these components is to ensure that development continues to fund and support growth. So regarding the transit-oriented areas legislation, we were required to designate our transit-oriented areas by bylaw and to remove minimum residential parking requirements, except for a required rate of accessible parking spaces. These items were completed in July of this year. The majority of our work remains to be completed, however, which involves updating our official community plan and zoning bylaw to comply with the several components of the legislation. So what is a transit-oriented area? A transit-oriented area is strictly defined by provincial regulations. In Coquitlam, this includes the land within 800 meters of any SkyTrain station. And the legislation sets minimum allowances for building density, which is expressed as a floor area ratio, and building height, which is expressed in stories. And this is organized in a tiered system with the highest densities and heights allowed closest to the SkyTrain station. Importantly, the term minimum in this context means a minimum that is imposed on the city by the province in our capacity to regulate density and heights. What that means is that a landowner would still be permitted to build below these standards, but the city simply can't restrict that landowner from building density or height below those standards. So for floor area ratio, while building height is relatively straightforward, it's worth taking a moment to explain this concept. Floor area ratio is a measure of a building's density, comparing the building's floor area relative to the area of the property on which it sits. In this example, if a property measures 10,000 square feet in area, then a building with a 2.0 FAR, floor area ratio, would have a total of 20,000 square feet. Further, as the example shows, the same floor area ratio can result in different heights depending on how much of the property is covered. This means that floor area ratio can provide a good sense of how much activity and servicing needs that are generated by a building, irrespective of its height. So for Coquitlam's transit-oriented areas, the legislation applies to all 8 SkyTrain stations that are either within Coquitlam's borders or near enough to be included to have include properties that are within Coquitlam. These locations are precisely defined and cannot be changed by the city. Any property that is wholly or partly within these rings or the rings of a transit-oriented area are included, including the individual tiers, regardless of local context, including the layout of lots and blocks, topography, or any other local characteristic. Since the transit-oriented areas cover quite a substantial amount of land and a diversity of neighborhoods across the city, we've staged our approach to implementing the legislation. Stage one simply was the adoption of the transit-oriented areas bylaw and removal of minimum residential parking, which was completed in the summer. And in the current stage, stage two, we are focused on parts of our transit-oriented areas that are already covered by plans that allow for this type of development. In particular, this includes the Coquitlam and Lougheed transit-oriented areas in Southwest Coquitlam and the core areas of city center. At the same time, we are reviewing land uses in the areas immediately surrounding the Coquitlam and Lougheed transit-oriented areas, which we have labeled shoulders. The purpose of the shoulder area planning process is to address the irregular boundaries that are created by the transit-oriented areas legislation, and to ensure that the official community plan continues to provide for a diversity of housing types. So the next three slides here show how the existing official community plan relates to transit-oriented areas using the Coquitlam neighborhood, a planned transit-oriented area, as an example. So the Coquitlam Lougheed neighborhood plan provides for a mix of uses and densities, with high densities focused on the lands closest to SkyTrain stations, transitioning outward into medium density apartments, townhousing, and then finally lower density residential uses on the periphery. The plan also provides for plans for the services and infrastructure that's needed to support this growth, including new and expanded parks, transportation connections, and utility upgrades. Now, the current flurry of development applications and construction activity that we see in the Coquitlam neighborhood and in the Lougheed neighborhood to the south is a direct result of this plan. Now, the provincial transit-oriented areas implements a tiered pattern that is conceptually similar to the existing neighborhood plan, but without the variation to account for local context. In a number of locations, our land use designations already allow for development at or above the legislated minimums. In other locations, we will need to change land use designations to align with the legislation. In Coquitlam, most of the impacted land is in fact in Tier 3, where in many locations, the current plan only allows for townhousing development or something lower. As a reminder, land in Tier 3 is permitted up to 8 stories, according to the legislation, up to 8 stories and a floor area ratio of 3.0. And this form of development roughly equates to what Coquitlam currently allows in our medium density apartment land use designation, which on this map is sort of the brown color with the single diagonal hatching. So this next map shows the properties that fall within each of the provincial tiers. The Coquitlam transit-oriented area results in a number of those irregular boundaries that I mentioned a moment ago. These are cases where the boundaries cut oddly across a block or leave individual properties orphaned. That is to say, in the event of a land assembly, they would be cut off from their neighbor or from neighboring properties, either inside the TOA or just outside the TOA. This map also shows some of the shoulder study areas, particularly in and around Coquitlam. The objective of the shoulder review is to address these irregular boundaries and to consider replacing the land within Tier 3 that would have been built as townhousing, but is now eligible to build as apartments. You may notice that the shoulder study areas do not completely encircle the transit-oriented areas. Locations left out of our study areas tend to have land use designation that already allows for apartment development. So an example of this would be at the top of the map along Clark Road. The review of shoulders and corridors is not intended to consider higher densities than this. So the next map here shows the extents of those stage 2 shoulders and corridors. As a reminder, the review of shoulders and corridors is not required by the province, and the minimum height and density standards of the transit-oriented areas do not apply. Land use changes in these areas will be shaped by community input alongside technical considerations and are subject to council approval. For stage 2, only shoulder areas adjacent to Coquitlam and Lougheed have been identified. The review of corridors is an outstanding piece of work from a previous city project, the Southwest Housing Review. Given prior commitments to complete this review, and given the corridor's proximity and connection to the transit-oriented areas, council supported a combined review, allowing us to review these areas or consider all of these areas in context together. So to sum up the deliverables for stage 2, it includes updating the official community plan land use designations and policies, updating our medium and high density zones to align with the minimum requirements and to continue to accommodate affordable housing and funding of community assets. Updating our associated plans for the infrastructure and amenities to support the growth, as well as the plans for shoulders and corridors as supported by council. So I will briefly touch on implementation of the other major housing legislation, that being small scale multi-unit housing, before we move on to the Q&A portion of the meeting. So this legislation applies throughout the city and requires the city to allow up to 4 units on most single-family properties. Originally, this was intended to be implemented by June 30th, 2024. However, the city was successful in receiving an extension to implement this legislation by June 30th, 2025, next year. Implementing the legislation will involve consolidating our existing single-family and infill zones into fewer small-scale zones, simplifying the regulations to ensure we have clear and straightforward expectations for both residents and developers, and ensuring that our parking requirements balance the demand for parking with development feasibility. Importantly, the legislation does not require the city to allow small-scale multi-unit housing within transit-oriented areas. So in terms of design, the small-scale multi-unit housing legislation would allow for a variety of unit and building types. Now, while the concept is relatively new in most areas of BC, here in Coquitlam, we have had a similar housing program for a number of years, named the Housing Choices Program. Housing Choices currently only applies to a limited area within Southwest Coquitlam, but provides a good metric of the building, the types of buildings that we would expect or anticipate to see under small scale multi-unit housing, including types of plex housing, duplex, triplex, fourplex, as well as laneway housing. So that concludes the presentation